I get to ask the first question, and that'll also give me a few. It's not on. Can you guys hear me? Check. There we go. So, as I was saying, moderator's prerogative. I'm going to ask the first question, and it'll also give me a few minutes to kind of go through these and summarize them, hopefully, because we do have just about, I think, 45 minutes or less than that, I believe. So my first question is kind of also based off of personal experience. When I was in high school, we were organizing in high school to fight against the economic sanctions imposed on Iraq. Early years of college, we were fighting against, the Afghan war and also the march to war in Iraq. And I literally remember, the rallies of millions around the world in London and New York and LA against the war. But I remember March 2003, driving to work and listening to NPR and hearing that, there was almost no challenge to us rushing off to war, as many of you cited. There was no challenge. It was a majority of the people, and we said, yes, let's do it. So many of us knew for 10 years, 20 years that we had been, our country and certain forces had been building up to that moment. And I remember driving to work, and I literally turned the radio off, and I changed the station, and I turned on some music just to drown it out. And it took me years to come back to the state where I could, instead of just drowning out the noise, where I could actually listen and become active. And I think that is a very pervasive problem for many of the folks out there, not necessarily in this room, but in the broader public, and especially for my generation and our generation of this general pathos that we can't do anything. It's not going to do any good. We stood there in millions and we still didn't make a change. So my question to you basically is, how do we give that hope to people, especially in the current context where radicalization has also become equated with that foreign threat? If I engage in radical activity, I'm going to be cited and looked at as part of the source of the problem. So how do we give that hope to people? How do we develop that moral imperative and also normalize the tools of civic disobedience? Because frankly, in the last 10 years, the lessons that many of us have gotten from recent history is that it just doesn't work.
We have to stop asking the question whether or not it'll work. That's a dangerous question. We have a moral imperative to resist. As Berrigan says, we're called to do the good, or at least the good insofar as we can determine it, and then we just have to let it go. It's not our job to know where the good goes. We have faith, those of us who come out of a faith community, that it goes somewhere. But we don't know. And it may be that by the end of our lives, things are worse. But that does not invalidate the acts of resistance, acts of rebellion. I have covered disintegrating societies. I've lived in repressive states. And I can tell you that isolated, even individual acts of protest have a tremendous power that ripple outwards, that is often not seen or understood at the time. I covered the Velvet Revolution in Czechoslovakia. I spent every night in the Magic Lantern with Václav Havel. And the walls of the city of Prague were covered with posters of a young university student who in 1968, to protest the Soviet invasion of his country, lit himself on fire in Wenceslas Square and died of his burns. The state media blocked all news of the event. It was a non-event in communist Czechoslovakia. The student demonstration that took place around his funeral was broken up by the police, and when his grave became a shrine, they dug his body up and cremated it and gave it to his mother and told her that she couldn't bury him in a cemetery. And yet, 3 weeks after Havel became president, he renamed Red Army Square in this boy's honor, and 10,000 people were there. I stood in Wenceslas Square when Czechoslovakia's most important singer who had sung the anthem of defiance in '68 and then been blacklisted. Not only was she not played on the airwaves, but the communist government destroyed her entire recording stock, and she spent the next 2 decades as a factory worker. And when she walked out on the balcony and sang that anthem, and I was standing with students from Charles University who were born long after she had been banished, they knew every word, and the tears were running down their face. And war is a force that gives us meaning. I write about a meeting I had with a Serb couple, Drago and Rosa Sorak, who had been in the safe area of Gorazda, surrounded by the Serbs during the war, and thrown their lot, as many ethnic Serbs did, with a Muslim-led government. But as the siege tightened and the paranoia grew, the Muslim police came and took their son Zoran from them. He disappeared. A few weeks after Zoran's disappearance, Zoran's wife gave birth to an infant girl who she was unable to feed, unable to nurse. They were giving the child weak cups of tea, and it was done. And on the 10th day at dawn, there was a knock on the door, and it was an illiterate Muslim farmer, a pair of rubber boots, named Fazl Fadic, who handed the family a liter of milk. And he came back the next day, and the day after that, and the day after that, and the day after that. He had 3 brown and white milk cows that he could only milk at night because of the sniper fire. And when the Muslim families in the apartment complex found out what he was doing, and milk was precious in Gorazda, as he would come up the stairs, they would insult him and spit on him and tell him to give the milk to the Muslim children and let the Chetnik babies, Chetnik being the slang term for Serb, die. I heard that story from the Soraks, despite all their bitterness and pain. And when they told it to me, they said, "It is our duty to tell you that not all Muslims are bad." And so I went into Gorazda and I found Fadic. His cows had been slaughtered for the meat. His apartment building had been reduced to rubble. He was sleeping in the basement with several other men, and they were collecting worm-eaten apples from an abandoned orchard and selling them on a sidewalk to try and make enough money to eat. And when I told him I'd seen the Soraks, he said to me, "And the baby, how is she?" Now, in that singular act of defiance lies an ocean of hope. He kept alive another narrative. He kept alive human compassion and empathy and dignity that crossed ethnic and racial lines. That little girl will grow up, and she may never meet Fazl Fadic, but she will grow up and know that she is alive because of a Muslim farmer. We have to stop asking ourselves what's practical. We have to stop asking ourselves what will work. We have to hold fast, as Dan Berrigan has throughout his life, to the moral imperatives of resistance to the good. And then finally, we have to have faith that even if all reality around us seems to point in the other direction, that good goes somewhere and will finally prevail.
That's a good story you told. So we got to look at things from the right perspective. So I saw this interview with Noam Chomsky, where Noam Chomsky talks about how people glorify the 60s. And Chomsky said that he would give a talk about the Vietnam War in 1965, 1966 in Boston, a very liberal area. And he said 4 people would show up to his talk. He said the person who organized the talk, the preacher of the church where he was speaking, a drunk who walked in off the street, and somebody who wanted to kill him. And he said prior to the Iraq invasion, millions of people all over the world protested the war before it ever began. He said that's never happened before in human history. And Vietnam, people didn't care until kids were getting drafted. And so, if you look at it from that perspective, it's very hopeful. Have human attitudes and American attitudes changed toward war? Absolutely. And the evidence I'll give you is not just the protests, but there's no draft. I mean, the people who wanted to draft gone more than anybody else were the people who profit from war. They knew that if there was a draft, America would never have a long overseas war with major combat operations. So, another thing that we can learn from the failure of the protests is good intentions are not enough. If good intentions were enough, we'd have world peace by now. Our actions have to be effective. And I completely understand why people don't join the peace movement. I don't think the peace movement is that effective. And I think the peace movement alienates a lot of Americans. And if we can't make peace with our own country and our own people, how can we possibly make peace with other countries? So we talk about how we have to humanize people in the Middle East, which is very important. We have to humanize Muslims, which is very important. But I met a lot of liberals and peace activists who simultaneously dehumanize and demonize conservatives and people in the Tea Party, all they're a bunch of morons. And I've had these reactions where people, they don't even know they're being insulting to you. So when I was in the Army, before I got out of active duty, I met some peace activists, and people would say to me, they'd say, wow, I thought you were going to be real aggressive and just shouting people down and real angry, but you're real calm and friendly and laid back. It's kind of a compliment that's an insult. It's kind of like somebody saying, wow, your parents didn't go to college and you're from Alabama and you're part black, and you're not nearly as stupid as I thought you were going to be. You know? So they had this stereotype. They're admitting to me that they thought I was going to be some sort of raving lunatic caveman, but they're like, Dad, you're actually a pretty calm guy. It's actually kind of insulting that they have a stereotype and they voice it without really understanding the people in the military. They get a little bit offended if you say, well, we're all a bunch of lunatic cavemen or a bunch of barbarians. So I think that we really have to be more effective. Good intentions aren't enough. And whenever events happen, I think that they're good. I mean, it depends upon how you look at it. For example, Sarah Palin running for president. Well, 200 years ago in America, women couldn't vote their own property. Isn't that a pretty good sign of progress that Sarah Palin can run for president? I doesn't mean I agree with what she says, but isn't that a sign of progress? And it also wakes us up. The fact that Sarah Palin's running for president, we can finally put to rest this idea that, well, the cause of war is men. It's all about men. If you believe that, then vote for Sarah Palin and see what happens. And, I mean, President Obama, right? It's amazing. An African-American got elected president. That's wonderful. And it wakes us up. It shows us reality. We can finally put to rest the idea that, well, the Democrats are going to end war and solve all our problems. Right? So these things, if we look at them in the right way, they actually wake us up, and we have to become more effective now, because we had these old myths we were believing. Well, the cause of war is men. It's all about men. Women, if they were in power, they would never send men to war. It's Republicans. Republicans are the problem. Democrats would never do that. It actually wakes us up, and now we got to confront reality. We have to be more effective, and good intentions are not enough. We have to become more effective, and we have to quit scapegoating. We can't keep saying, well, the reason we're not being effective is because Americans are apathetic. I mean, are we engaging Americans in the best way possible? We have to look at our own actions. Are we being as effective as we can be as a movement? Are we giving people hope? Are we giving people some sort of meaning? And are we bringing people on board? Are we going beyond the choir to really get Americans on board? So.
I think, I like everything that's just been said by my fellow panelists, and I think this question of how do you give people hope, I think ultimately the best answer is you stop being addicted to hope and being addicted to success and needing a movement where you have small successes, otherwise everybody gets depressed and goes home and doesn't keep working for the big success. I mean, I think ultimately that's the answer. But it's interesting that this question never used to come up in these kinds of events until about 2009, at which point you just couldn't avoid it. I mean, any speaking event I went to beginning in 2009, and it's died off a little bit now, you just couldn't get away from the "why don't we all kill ourselves" question. And it cannot be coincidental that there was this hopium withdrawal going on, that people had invested all of this hope in putting a new face on the throne, and that was going to save us. And we're about to go through this nonsense again. It's going to be way worse than a royal wedding. We're going to put everything into who's going to be the new emperor, as if a different emperor could save us. And then the loss of all of these expectations, where we, for the first time in history, a politician was going to be better than all of his promises, where he was secretly pretending to be worse than he was really going to be, and now we're disappointed that he wasn't. All of that people have done to themselves is part of, the loss of hope. And so if you outgrow the need for successes and expectation of more quick successes and the need to be hopeful and optimistic, and you do what you have a moral duty to do, and you enjoy doing it, not masochistically, but you enjoy taking the responsibility and the solidarity and the sacrifice of doing it with your neighbors and your fellow people, then you don't go through those ups and downs, and you just keep building. And I think that there are structural ways that you can help build people's confidence, even if they do depend on those causes for hope and visions of success. I mean, it's useful for us to build our own communication system so that we can tell each other everything that's going on. My email box is just crammed with stories of success and stories of effort and stories of sacrifice. There are people going to prison every day in this country for peace and justice, and it's not on your television, it's not in your newspaper. We did cause the United Nations to make the Iraq War illegal. You can't say we had no effect. We taught people that wars are based on lies. The war lost popularity right alongside that, and we resisted the similar lies on Iran for years. And you can show people that there is progress, but you don't want to make people dependent on that progress. And so I think, coming around to where you could turn back on NPR, I think, maybe leave that crap off, because the U.S. media teaches disempowerment. It teaches us to believe we have no power, right? And television, just as a medium, makes people passive to the point where they can't even turn the thing off. But all U.S. media acts as if activism doesn't exist, acts as if pressure had no impact, acts as if the people cannot possibly influence the government, even when they could, and even when they've just done so. And so I think there are advantages to clearer thinking in, yes, understanding what's out there and what we're up against, but avoiding at least the poison of turning one of those horrible boxes on in our living rooms. So that would be my advice.
This year represents the 50th anniversary, as I understand it, of the Freedom Riders campaign and effort. And when I think about these very brave, intergenerational, intercultural, interracial efforts to integrate interstate travel and to bring down the walls of segregation, historically, it provides for us evidence where hope can have contextual base in fact. I sit here today as evidentiary hope. Because we have seen it, we know it exists. Therefore, look at best practices from our past and appropriate them to, in a new way, the realities of our present with the same sense of commitment and willingness to suffer, as it were, because you will suffer. To think that we will make a change in this cultural war without suffering is, in my opinion, at the very least, I'd say, yeah, that's a good word for it. Naive, thank you. It is to be, and to know that suffering becomes, our stories of suffering become the source of hope for those who will read about what we do or what we have done 50 years from now. And so we ourselves reflect on the stories of our past as sources of hope, craft our narrative in the present as reinventions of hope, with the full understanding that there are those who will look at us 50 years from now and draw from our examples hope. I was listening the other day to the story of the grandchild of Irene Morgan. Anybody know Irene Morgan? Ever heard of Irene Morgan? Before there was a Rosa Parks, there was an Irene Morgan. Boarded a bus going to Baltimore, perhaps. She was on a bus and she was sitting next to a woman who had a child, a black woman, mother, 27-year-old, and she was asked and told to get up and give her a seat to a white passenger that was coming on the bus. She refused. And when the bus driver grabbed at her, she refused to get up. The bus driver got off the bus. At the next stop, got a police officer to come get her. She kicked him in the groin. And she determined that she was not going to allow herself to be disrespected on a bus where she paid the same fare as everybody else. Now, when I read a story like that, that gives me courage. If she could face what she faced in 1944, I could go to jail with Jordan Regis or anybody else in 2011. I can't go to jail anymore, so don't expect me, don't ask me to. I've already been told I'll be drawn up on charges. Not to say that I wouldn't do it, but the bottom line is this. Part of what hope exacts from us is the cost that Bonhoeffer talks about. That we suffer, we die. And in that is the hope. If we think we're going to do this without any kind of cost, we're fooling ourselves. It's going to cost us. But we've got to do it today so that our sons and daughters will be able to do it tomorrow.
Thank you so much.